The Lord of the Rings film trilogy screenwriter Philippa Boyens explains why Tolkien's stories are so beloved. He didn't compromise anything. I thought this was a really interesting interview that Philippa Boyens gave back in 2003 while promoting The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. And she was specifically asked why she had described J.R. Tolkien as kind of an amateur writer. And instead of basically what you might see today, where they're just kind of lampooning Tolkien or something like that, she actually turned it into massive amounts of praise for Tolkien and explained why his stories are so beloved. So let's get into this here. This interview came courtesy of us from theonering.com founder Jonathan Watson, who recently uploaded the interview to his YouTube channel. I suggest you watch all of it. You can watch it here on boundintocomics.com or watch it on YouTube at The One Ring. Highly recommend listening to it. Lots of really good stuff in there, aside from what we're covering here. But let's get into what she said. She was, like I said, she was asked why she had previously described Tolkien as an amateur writer, and this is kind of how she responded. She says, what we mean by that is that he didn't set out to write a novel in the same way that professional writers do. He's not a novelist. He's an incredibly, I would say, almost unsurpassed storyteller. Absolutely high praise. I think she's absolutely right on that. I don't think that there is maybe another storyteller that gets to Tolkien's level. I think C.S. Lewis is up there. I think maybe you can look at Shakespeare, and then obviously you can go back to like Homer and the Odyssey, and then obviously you can point to the Bible and God being the ultimate storyteller, right? And I think Tolkien would actually agree with that. But nevertheless, she goes on and says, and that to say he is an amateur, it was only to the extent that I think that's where a lot of the heart of the story came from. Well, the truth. It's an incredibly truthful story, and it's not slick. He needed an editor, you know. God knows the amount of repetition we came across when you actually get into those books, and that was a big problem for us. And a lot of the stuff he did in reportage, like, you know, he had a great idea, and instead of going back and rewriting, like, for example, you could tell that suddenly he had this wonderful idea about how Gandalf escaped from Saruman. Why didn't he do that whole Saruman-Gandalf confrontation live? Why didn't he follow Gandalf too? Why was it in the reportage? And I can't help thinking that things like that, or certain things like that, suddenly he had this great idea, and so he decided to tell it as reportage instead of taking you there as an audience. And I think an editor would have said, take the audience and tell the story from that with more immediacy. Maybe that's what an editor would have said. It would have been easier for us. However, she then posited, but then, you know, that was his privilege. I think what's so great about this is that he didn't compromise anything. He told the story the way he wanted to tell it, which is why it is as rich as it is, and why it is as personal as it is, because it is a very personal story. And I think absolutely right here. Tolkien has actually talked about how personal it is. Obviously, he's discussed how he doesn't like allegory, but he's also made it very clear that he did put himself into this. That's one of the reasons how he explains how it was a Catholic work upon revision, because he was a Catholic. So thus it was a Catholic work because he was putting himself into the book. The stuff in that book that works the best is that it is very, very personal, Boyens said. I think the relationship between Frodo and Sam, the whole tragedy of the Shire, was very much things that he genuinely felt, you know, drawn from his own experiences, which is why it's often, I think, it's why you can attribute the success of these, I think it's what you can attribute the success of these stories to. So I think there's a little bit of an interesting tell here, because she does mention the Shire, and we don't actually get that in the Peter Jackson trilogy. It's a shame we don't get that, and that's one of the things that she's actually highlighting here as one of the things that makes the books stand out, and we don't actually get that in the movie. I do think that is one of the shortcomings of the films, is that we did not get the tragedy of the Shire, but I really like what she's saying here about how it felt so personal. You're really drawn into the experiences of the characters. The characters feel real. Their relationships are real. You can relate to those relationships. It doesn't matter who you are. It's just a really, really strong storytelling, and goes to her high praise of Tolkien as an unsurpassed storyteller. But not only did Boyens explain why she believes Tolkien's Lord of the Rings novels are so beloved, but she also shared her thoughts on why the film adaptations have been so successful. And she says, and people got into the spirit of what Peter was trying to do, don't you think, which is tell these stories as if they were real. Find the honesty in it so that it is real sentiment, not sentimental, that it's not manufactured emotion. Peter hates that. And I think that is the ultimate way where you can see the distinction between Jackson's trilogy and what we were getting in Prime Video's The Rings of Power. I think Boyens makes this very, very clear. You see the real sentiment in Jackson's movies, and I think that's why people gravitate toward it. And I think people saw through this fake sentimentality, this manufactured emotion that they tried to create within the Rings of Power. In fact, they've kind of just ignored what Tolkien was talking about with the Second Age. The Second Age is supposed to be dire and dreary and awful. It is the rise of evil. It's the rise of Sauron. And instead, they're trying to, like, we need to incorporate these Harfoots because that's what a Tolkien story really would have. And it's like, no, you are manufacturing this. This is fake. And people saw through it. They saw that it wasn't real. And I think Boyens here is giving some really good advice for the people from Prime Video. Unfortunately, they clearly did not take it, and they still aren't taking it, even from the fans. But nevertheless, she goes on and says, in fact, he always destroys my stuff like that, which is great, which is what a writer needs, and he makes you go deeper, and he makes you find the truth of that moment as a writer, which is great, which is what you need. Because, boy, I could churn out, some stuff that you can do it off the top of your head. It's probably good enough for some people, but it's not good enough for Peter or Fran, actually. And I think that's also interesting, too, insight into Peter Jackson, and what I do think why this trilogy stood out is he was pushing his writers to find those moments. And I don't really feel like we see that in a lot of the movies and TV shows now. Obviously, I think a lot of it's done for propaganda's sake, so they're not really trying to push people to find any kind of deeper truth or how Tolkien would describe it, finding that eucatastrophe moment that all fairy story is supposed to strive for. But yeah, so and I think she's pointing out here that this is something that is missing, I think, in Hollywood writers' rooms, just in kind of the Hollywood culture, is people giving like really good, tough criticism and getting them to strive to create things better. Instead, we're getting stuff like the Marvel Studios movies, we're getting stuff like Rings of Power, getting stuff like Wheel of Time, where it's clearly done by a committee, it's very manufactured. You've got people like Martin Scorsese even very clearly pointing out how that is the case. And then even James Gunn, who does a lot of these comic book movies, is calling it out as well. So I think that is something we need to get back to. I really like what Boyens is saying. It really shows kind of a different mentality to how maybe film making was approached 20 years ago as to what it is now. Just 20 years ago, Philippa Boyens is talking about Peter Jackson was pushing me. He was really criticizing me, pushing me to find that moment. And now I don't think we see that at all anymore. But I thought that was a really interesting commentary. I'm probably going to do another video on another portion of her section where she actually talks about the relationship between Sam and Frodo, specifically because this keeps coming up as lunatic activists are trying to misinterpret, I think, on purpose, what their relationship is to try and turn it into their agenda. And she does kind of address that as well in this interview, and I will be covering that on the website and probably here on YouTube as well. But let me know what you make of Philippa Boyens' comments here. I really found it very illuminating, and I hope you do as well.
Subscribe for more.